Next from Springfield, we sit down with former Governor Jim Edgar and get his thoughts on reforms he would like to see that could fix Illinois' government and budget. The governor also opines on the upcoming gubernatorial election and what the Illinois Republican Party can do to get more votes from Chicago and minority communities. This runs about 45 minutes.
Governor Jim Edgar, thanks for joining us again on the Illinois Channel.
Good to be with you.
I wanted to ask about a variety of things, but first I just read the other day a number of people were appointed as Edgar Fellows. I think Ron Sandak, the state representative, Emily Burke, who I believe is a county official down by Carbondale. What are the Edgar Fellows and what's their purpose?
Well, the Edgar Fellows is basically a program that we identify who we think are some of the up-and-comers in the state of Illinois, both in state government and local government, some people in the private sector or not-for-profit, and bring them together so they get to know each other. I think it's very important that the people have a personal relationship with folks that they're dealing with in government. Republicans and Democrats can get along. They used to. Unfortunately, the last few years that hasn't been true. And people from downstate and people from Chicago really have a lot more in common than they do differences. And so we hope that these people, some of them are going to be running the state in 10, 20 years, that they'll know each other already, they'll respect each other, they'll understand the other point of view. And as a result, I think we can solve problems a lot better. We haven't been solving problems very well in Illinois or nationally. And I think one of the main reasons is we don't know how to get along. We don't know how to respect other points of view and to try to find some common ground and solve the problems.
How many fellows are there in each class?
Approximately 40. And usually for the most part they're under the age of 40. Most of them have just started out in whatever their current governmental position is, or if they're in the private sector, they're people who deal with government and perhaps might be in public office sometime in the future, or they're at least going to be in the ball game as far as setting public policy. So we think it's very important that they get to know each other.
What do they do? And it lasts a year, I guess?
No, it's not even a year. It's just a few days. We're going to expand it this year to 4.5 days. And before it's been 3.5 days. Well, that's not very long.
At what time, like a conference?
Yeah, they stay overnight. It's pretty intense. I mean, we work from about 8 o'clock to 8 o'clock, and we let them have a little time after that to socialize. But they do get to know each other. One of the things I'm a big stickler on is seating arrangements. This is something that goes back to my days in the legislature. I've always thought that we ought to move people around so they get to know each other, and same thing in the Governor's Conference and the Secretary of State Association. So one of the things we do, it's a small thing, but it helps. Every session, and we have probably about 16 sessions, they sit by somebody different. Because I'm a great believer, after especially spend a lot of time sitting on the floor of the Illinois General Assembly, that your seatmates you get to know and you get to be friends. So while we don't have as much time as you do in the legislature, there is at least an opportunity for them to get to know each other and to know something about them other than just what their political affiliation is or their political title is. And it's worked well. I mean, I've been amazed already. We've had several legislators that have got together in each other's districts. We've had an alderman come down to a Democratic Chicago alderman come down to a Republican state senator's district and see what his district's like, and they're going to exchange visits. And I've had one legislator who is in one party in one house tell me they now know people in the other house in the other party that they didn't know before, and they feel like they can trust them and they can go to them and they need help. So this is already, I think, is worked as far as getting people to know each other and be able to work together. Most of the problems we have in Illinois are not partisan issues. They shouldn't be partisan issues. And most of them aren't ideology. It just takes some common sense to find solutions, but you've got to be able to know and trust the person you're negotiating with. And I think we've got away from that in government. And so we hope in a small way to kind of start us back on that course. When I first came to Springfield, when Republicans, Democrats actually went out and had dinner together and socialized together. So it made it a lot easier for them to try to compromise when you had to compromise.
I want to get into some of the issues and maybe what your thoughts are on those. But I was curious because you came in, for those who don't recall, when the state was again in fiscal problems back, was it 91, I guess
91.
you became governor. I think you were called Governor No back during your first term. But you left the state after 8 years, left the governor's office, I should say, with $1 billion surplus. So you
Billion and a half.
you started,
We want to take every credit for every penny we can.
well, I remember interviewing some of the comptroller candidates. When was that? The election of '98, I guess. And the questions were, what would you do with the state's surplus? So, but I'm curious, is what do you think now, for all that work you went through and all the struggle to get the state back on track, to now find it where it is?
Success in government can be fleeting. I mean, one of the questions I'm asked the most, what would you do different? Well, for the most part, there's very little I do different, but there is one thing. I would have taken that $1.5 billion and locked it away. I mean, at the time, I really was surprised. I didn't think the legislature would go on a spending spree and go back into debt and go through all the agony we went through in the early 90s. But it took them about 2 months to spin through that under Governor Ryan. And unfortunately, I wish I'd either had that mythical lockbox that Al Gore talked about in the 2000 presidential race, or I'd have put it in the pension funding or done something to it. I never dreamed that the legislature, after all we'd gone through in the 90s to get out of that mess, would get right back into it. So I guess that's one thing I'd have done different. But it does make me realize that you can have things going well, and in 2 or 3 years everything can be shambles. You got to stay disciplined. You have to remember that it's cyclical. Now, we had some help from the economy, got a little better, but we also had cut spending. We really were watching new programs and making sure we could afford anything we put on the books.
I think it was a question it was discipline. You just said.
Discipline
I mean, the
is
fact
probably
is
the
when
most
the money
important.
came in, you just didn't spend every
Discipline
dime.
is probably the most important ingredient to making sure you stay on fiscal soundness, and we haven't had a lot of fiscal discipline for a long time.
Can we, one of the questions I was going to have is it possible for us to create a system, and I was thinking in terms of you getting things fixed and then it fell apart. Is it possible to have reforms in government that keeps the system from going off the tracks, or is it always dependent upon who are the cast of characters at any one time?
To a great extent, it has a lot to do with who the cast of characters. For example, we really had a solution to the pension issue
Back in '95?
in '95. If they had followed that, it would have worked. But two things: they did an early retirement that aggravated the situation, and then they went with a holiday and they didn't pay into the pension plan, and then 1 year they borrowed money to pay into the pension plan. So, if they'd have stayed disciplined on the pension plan, we would not be in the mess we're in today. Now, we still would have had some problems because the stock market went down. But we were in trouble before the stock market went down, both in the pension plan and our budget. We just did not stay disciplined, and it's a very important ingredient in making sure that the fiscal house is in order. And unfortunately, we haven't had that. And for a great extent, that's got to come from the governor. The governor has got to be the person who's going to really provide the leadership when it comes to financial matters. It's just not in the nature of the legislature to do that. In the way we're set up in Illinois, the governor has broad powers, particularly dealing with the budget. And if the governor is not really interested in making sure we stay fiscally disciplined, if he's trying to make everybody happy, say yes all the time, then we're going to be in this predicament more times than not.
To what extent these days are you engaged in the debates that are going on in the Capitol? Do people pick up the phone, whether in the legislature or occasionally, I guess you talk to the Governor Quinn?
Well, not too often. I mean, I get reporters will call me and ask me what I think, hoping that I'll say what they're doing is bad so they have a story. For the most part, I'm out of that arena. I'm not in the legislature. I'm not the governor. I don't claim to have all the information they might have. But I guess I'm like a lot of people, when they get older, they look at the younger generation and they wonder where we're going. And I have to say, I have that concern. And then I think back, you know, I probably had people when I was governor that looked at me askance and thought, what the world is he doing? So I try to limit my comments, but I have to admit I do still have some strong interest, strong opinions, but I don't have any leverage.
You know, I want to talk about some of the reforms. In fact, a couple of guys you know, in fact, you wrote one of the endorsements on the back of the book called Fixing Illinois with Jim Nolan and Tom Johnson. So let's talk about some of the reforms, both economic and electoral. On the economic, are there any things in particular you would be doing differently? You know, one of the debates, primarily debate, was, are we going to have a tax reform, and what kind of tax? Would you do anything in that realm or any other?
I think we could broaden the sales tax. You know,
To apply to services?
services, I think we have to look at the retirement part of it. I mean, I remember the day I was a staffer in the Senate when they exempted retirement income from the income tax year after it passed, and nobody realized how much money they were talking about. They were kind of giving up. So there are other things to look at. But I think people in Illinois, there's no silver bullet. There's no easy tax. If there was, we'd have done it a long time ago. And I think people in Illinois still don't appreciate the fact that compared to other industrial states, we're still not a very high taxing state. And that's been part of our dilemma. That's why we got into part of the problems we got into. We were trying to, you know, to live on a higher lifestyle than our tax revenues could really afford. And, you know, that's why we can't get off the problems we're on now. I mean, we really haven't made much of a dent on the debts we owe. You know, we still are drawing out payment cycles and doing a lot of things that I think is unfortunate. So, you know, I think we have to look at the revenue side. I thought they made a mistake 3 years ago when they raised the income tax. I thought they made two mistakes. One, they didn't put some cuts in place and hold the spending, but also that they made it temporary, because temporary taxes just don't work around here. Once we start spending, we get it, we spend it, and then now we're in a very difficult situation. I mean, this budget that they called it a budget. I mean, it's a farce. I mean, it's one of the worst budgets I've ever seen, and they all admit it. You know, they're going to have to draw out payment cycles. You know, they're probably going to have to do something in 6 months just to get by the election, and that's not a good approach to budgeting. As tough as it is to make those difficult decisions, we used to be able to get those things done. Unfortunately, they don't seem to be able to get them done now at the end of session like we could back 15, 20 years ago.
What's changed in your mind?
I think it goes back a little bit when I was talking about earlier that people don't know how to get along, they don't know how to compromise. They would rather try to embarrass the other side than they would solve problems. And that's true of both parties. It's not just limited to Springfield, it's probably even truer in Washington, D.C. But in Springfield, until, you know, even through the 90s, for the most part, we'd fight and call each other names, but at the end of the day, we knew we had to solve the problems before the session was over. We didn't just kick the can down the road. And, you know, too often they just kick the can down the road. And it's interesting, too. You've had one party in control. So it's not always the two parties fighting. It's just the inability for a lot of elected officials today to make those tough decisions. And my experience, if you explain to people why you're making the tough decisions, you know, they'll give you the benefit of the doubt. Now, you can't go to them every day and do something they don't want you to do, but there are times when you can raise a tax, you can cut spending, and explain it to the majority of the people. One of the other problems I think today is that most people are not elected in general elections. They're not elected in November, they're elected in primaries. And the Pew Institute just put out a study about a week ago that I think is anybody that has an interest in understanding politics today, they need to look at that study. And it tells how the American electorate is getting much more hardened in their views, much more extremes. They've doubled in the last 10 years.
I think we might paraphrase that the people who are the moderates and kind of would work together maybe are so turned off by the political landscape that what's left are the people who are hardcore on both sides.
Well, those are the people who will vote in a primary. A lot of the people in the middle, a lot of people who are not hard and fast in their views. I mean, they might be a little more flexible. They don't vote in primaries, but the far right and the far left of the parties, they will turn up primary day because they're very motivated, but they don't believe in compromise. They don't. It's our way or no way. We'd rather be right than win, and that's a whole different attitude than many of the people in the middle who say just solve the problem, compromise and let's move on. But unfortunately, they don't vote in primaries, and most people, particularly the way legislative districts are drawn now, you get past the primary, you don't have to worry about the general election. So you have extremes in both parties that have an inordinate amount of control over elected officials, and as a result, I think those elected officials are either afraid or they don't want to compromise. They don't want to meet the opposition halfway or try to find common ground so they can move on and deal with the next problem.
A lot of people here would say, and we have an effort underway now to have term limits, and saying, too many of these politicians aren't making the hard choices because they're more concerned about maintaining their careers than servicing the needs of the state. I know from a previous talk you gave, you're not a big fan of term limits, but what changes would you have so that people in government are not goosing the system for their own benefit, and that maybe we can keep the interest on what's good for the entire state?
Well, first of all, term limits, when they've had them, it's the legislature's been more partisan. New members, they've got all the answers. They're pretty. They don't want to compromise. Most of them got there through primaries that are pretty strident voters, and so they're not apt to compromise. So I think it would aggravate the situation even more so than we already have. I think people ought to hold their legislators accountable, vote in primaries. A lot of people just don't vote in a primary, and unfortunately, I think if we moved the primaries back and had them in the summertime where most states do, we'd have more participation. I'd like to see open primaries where you don't have to publicly be recorded either a Republican or a Democrat. You'd have to make that choice, but it'd be a secret choice. I mean, you would have to make the choice, are you going to take a Republican ballot or Democratic ballot, but it wouldn't be public information because a lot of folks, particularly in business, won't vote because they don't want people to think they're a Republican or Democrat and not shop in their store. I used to face that in my hometown of Charleston when I was running years ago. So I think we get more participation in the primaries. I think there ought to be more transparency on outside interest of legislators. I mean, legislators often have outside interest, particularly the legal profession. Something about you can't find out who their clients are. I've never understood that. If you own a store, you know they own a store and what they sell, but if you're a lawyer, you can't know their clients. Well, I don't know. I don't think we're at the point where we say they can't have an outside income. I think we'd lose a lot of good people. But I do think we ought to have maybe more transparency in knowing where their outside incomes are coming from.
Well, on that, would not the campaign finance laws disclose at least where they're getting their money from? I mean,
getting their campaign money,
yeah,
not their personal money. And again, a lawyer gets it from his law firm. Well, who are their clients? I mean, we every so often we have a legislator, one in particular I can think of, who stands up and says, I have to recluse myself, Well, that person's still in Springfield. In some cases, they're the most powerful people in Springfield. I think the public at least ought to know why they're, who that client is that they're not voting on this issue. And they can determine, is there a conflict? It goes in campaign financing. I've never been a big fan of limits. I don't think they've worked. Mm-hmm. We see there's all kinds of loopholes.
And I was going to ask you, too, I was going to ask you because you had said after Judy DePinka ran for governor against Rod Blagojevich and his ability to raise the amount of money that he did, that you had not been a fan of campaign finance laws, but you were perhaps rethinking your position.
Only if the Supreme Court will ever change their ruling and say an individual can't spend any amount of their own money. I mean, we just went through a primary for governor on the Republican side that was decided by money. I mean, Rauner won over Kirk Dillard because he outspent him about at least 10-1, if not more than that. I mean, that we've never, I don't think even the Blagojevich-Topeka thing wasn't quite that lopsided. But, you know, he could put him out of his own money in the Supreme Court. You can't limit an individual. So until the Supreme Court changes, and I don't think they're going to change, because both Republicans and Democrats in the Supreme Court have always upheld an individual's right to spend any amount of their own money on their campaign. I don't know if limits are ever going to be very effective. The one thing that has, I think, been helpful is disclosure, where you get your money from. And I think that has been helpful, at least for the media and the public, to know where campaign money is coming from. Now, I'd maybe put a couple little things in there saying you can't transfer from one political fund to another, because I think that's a way you kind of get around that transparency. But I think that limits, unfortunately, just haven't done it. Again, I think people need to pay more attention to candidates and their past record. Don't get too hung up on their current rhetoric. I mean, I've been through a lot of campaigns, and what's said in a campaign, often you never hear it after the election, because that's not really what you got to deal with. But how a person has conducted themselves in the past is a very good indication of how they're going to conduct themselves in the future. Character doesn't change after an election. Issues often do.
Mm-hmm. On one of the things too, of the redistricting, I think you were the fair map. You're in favor of that, taking the ability to draw the maps, political maps, out of the hands of the legislature.
I am. And that's I've come 180 degrees on that. I did reapportionment when about the third year I was a staffer back in 1971. In fact, the Constitution actually worked. We compromised on that year, and we had a map that was pretty evenly balanced. We haven't had one since. I think it's extremely important that we have districts that are kind of even, that we have people elected in November, not in the dead of winter in primaries, when very few people vote. And I think changing the way we redistrict, giving it to a group that's not just worried about, well, we're the party, we're going to make sure our party has all the power they need, to make sure those districts really kind of make more sense geographically, and you know, that we don't have these gerrymandered districts, and that people kind of know who their legislators are, and that those legislators have kind of a little more of a cohesive district than they maybe do now. But I think most importantly, I think that we would see that we'd have districts where it is a contest on Election Day, on November. And I think that would elect people to the legislature who have to answer not only to people in their party, but to independents and people in the other parties, because it takes all three of them to get elected. Just as when we run statewide. That's why I think a governor often is a little more middle of the road in this state, because this is a very diverse state. You just can't rely on, no way you could just rely on Republicans. There aren't enough left in Illinois to elect you a dog catcher. But to get elected governor, you've got to appeal to independents and to Democrats. And I think that makes for a healthier public policy arena, where most of the people there know they've got to listen to all segments of their district or their state, instead of just a few that vote in the primary.
You know, I was wondering about, speaking of that, I am not from Illinois, so I've been here for roughly 17, 18 years, but
still confused, aren't you? I mean, I've been here all my life, and I'm confused.
You know, I suppose the thing is, I sometimes think that no real change will come to Illinois until you start to have competitive elections in Chicago, when you have so much power concentrated in such a small geographic, or well, it's a large geographic area, but so much of the state is in that one city, and the Republicans virtually don't run there. What can the Republican Party do, if anything, to start picking up votes in Chicago, raise the amount of voters that they get within the black community, the Hispanic community, and others, so that they broaden their base?
Well, they have to change directions. I mean, when I ran for governor, you know, I carried the Hispanic. I split them the first time and carried them the second time. Did well in the African American community for a Republican. We haven't done that well since. And part of it is, unfortunately, the National Republican Party, particularly on the immigration issue, I think is scared away a lot of the Hispanic voters who should be, in many ways, allied with the Republican Party. In the case of President Bush, they were. In the case of me here in Illinois, they were. But unfortunately, I think we're seeing them move more and more to the Democratic camp. And if they end up voting like the African Americans vote, the Republican Party has no future. I mean, we're going to go the way of the Whigs. And I think that's something at the national level the party has made a major mistake. And we started to correct it, but unfortunately the primary, it's the primary again, the other day, it's kind of sent shockwaves through the Republican Party when Cantor got beat. And many of the experts blame it, it's not on the Tea Party, but it's on immigrations. And so that's probably doomed any immigration reform in the near future. And I think that's going to be blamed on the Republicans. So it is important that Republican Party kind of becomes the party of the big tent. We talk about it, but unfortunately, House Republicans in Washington haven't followed that policy. They kind of follow the wishes of the people who elected them in those primaries, and they have a tendency to be much more to the right than where most of the electorate is. The one thing, though, I'll say at Chicago, the Chicago mayor is not as strong in Springfield as he was when I first came to Springfield. I mean, Mayor Daley was the mayor, and the Mayor Daley, not the last Mayor Daley, but the original Mayor Daley, and he was all power down here, and the Democrats didn't do anything without his approval. That really hasn't been true in the last 20 years. Mike Madigan has been
That's
the
what I
power.
was going to ask. Has Mike Madigan become the new
No
Daley?
mayor tells Mike Madigan what to do. Now, he might talk to him, he might trade with him, but he doesn't tell him what to do. And so the Chicago thing, as far as in the legislature, it's not as what fifth floor of City Hall says doesn't always prevail as it used to. Now, there's still a lot of Democrats out of the city of Chicago, and part of that is they've controlled the remap process. So they have districts that go out in the suburbs, and they bring in enough votes to give them their 200,000 votes to whatever they need now in a legislative district, but the majority is still in the city, so they can retain those seats. Again, I think a impartial redistricting committee would probably see more compact districts, and you wouldn't have those fingers going out from Democratic strongholds, which is basically the city of Chicago to suburban areas. And I think that would give a little more of a balance to it. But I think the Republicans are their biggest enemies right now. They've got to broaden their base. They've got to be a party that's for something, not against. They've got to recognize that younger generation, women, minorities, are very apprehensive about the way the Republican Party has been moving the last few years. And that, I think, has been indicated in the last few elections. I mean, there's no way that President Obama should have been reelected with unemployment as high as it was last year. But I think, unfortunately, Mitt Romney sent the wrong message on issues like immigration and some other issues. And so you had groups go almost en masse to vote for President Obama. Same thing here in Illinois. 4 years ago, after the Blagojevich scandal and the problems the state was in, and Governor Quinn's inability to get things done in the legislature, his low approval rating, we should have won the governor's race. But we didn't, and we lost it in the suburbs among women because we were perceived, our candidate for governor was perceived too far to the right. So we're going to have to change that to be able to win, I think, in Illinois, and I think nationally as well, and to be a viable party in a two-party system.
Do you think it's just on the abortion issue when you say the women, or is it
No,
other issues?
well, I think that's a big issue. I think it's other issues that go along with that. I think, unfortunately, and we probably fight the gay rights issue, the marriage thing, too long. I mean, that, I think, has passed by, and we ought to accept that, and we ought to be more tolerant on other issues dealing with gay people than maybe we have been as a party. I think abortion and women issues are very important, that we project a little more sympathetic image than we've projected.
On the other hand, why would people vote Republican?
I think
if
Republicans...
if you're selling the
Yeah.
party, what would you sell?
I think on fiscal policy, we still are much better than the Democrats, particularly in the state of Illinois. I think while I sometimes think we maybe go too far in some of those issues. I think we are much more fiscally responsible than what we've seen from the Democrats in Illinois the last 10 years. I think the question of transparency, I think Republicans are a little more open. I mean, I don't think there's as many conflicts among Republicans as there is among Democrats. Not to say that we're perfect, we have our issues. But I think on ethics and on finance, I think Republicans, those are the two strong issues that we have been elected on in the past in Illinois. But we can't scare people on the other issues. And I think the party nationwide has scared people on other issues. And, you know, we can't do that and hope to survive because the numbers just aren't there. I mean, there aren't all that many old white males left. We're dying off. And so we're going to have to figure out how we reach out to other segments of the population.
You know, I remember Aaron Schock was talking a few years ago at the state convention and was saying when he was first elected at 23 to the Illinois House, in what was a Democratic district, he had 5% of the black vote, but he went out and worked the black community for 2 years so that when he was running for re-election and he was the #1 target, he picked up, I think he had 20% of the black vote. But he told the story that blacks would say to him, "You're the first Republican in 25 years to even ask for my vote." Why does that happen? I've had other black candidates running as Republicans. One was running a few years ago against Bobby Rush. Now, was he going to be elected? No, but he said, I can't get the party to even give me $1,000. Now, this is for running for Congress. But it seems like the Republican Party, the leadership, just writes off areas of the map and just say, we can't be competitive there, so we're not even going to try.
Well, I mean, you've got Republicans, particularly when you're in the minority in Illinois and you're out of power, you have limited money and you're going to spend it where you think you can do the most good. I think the chance of an African-American Republican being elected is pretty slim in many of those districts. Now, you take Aaron Schock, he got 20%, but that doesn't elect you 20%. That helps you when you're trying to put together a total vote. And, you know, he was the incumbent and he did pay attention. I got 25% the first time I ran for governor, and I'd spent a lot of time in the African-American community. That's probably the high water of the last 50 years for Republicans in the African-American community. But if that's all you have voting in a district, that's not going to be enough. I had a lot of people tell me, why are you spending so much time in the African-American community? I said, well, I think I can get some votes. Well, I got some votes, not a lot, but I got some votes, and it probably in a close election, that made a difference.
Doesn't it take, but as a party, don't you have to work that through successive elections to, like making candles, build it up a layer at a time?
Most of parties, they look at one election at a time, you know. No, there are things you can do, but it is, I think, easier a statewide candidate who doesn't need to carry the African-American community, but doesn't want to get destroyed in the African-American community. You know, if a Republican can pick up 15 to 20% in an African-American community, he would be or she would be doing very, very well. So it's worth spending some time, some effort. But I can understand why the House Republican Campaign Committee doesn't want to put money into a House Republican race in a solely African-American district. It's probably not a
well, not that you're going to win, but it seemed to me that even if for every vote you get, you're taking a vote, let's say for someone running statewide, whether it's comptroller.
Well, now a statewide candidate, I understand why
you're not going to win that district.
I wonder why a statewide candidate would do that. But you got to understand, the House Republican campaign is worried about electing House Republicans. They're not really worried about electing a governor. I mean, and so you've got to think, what's their goal? Their goal is to get control of the House, and you're going to try to. And when you have limited dollars. Now, if you had unlimited dollars, yeah, you could do some long-term planning. But and often you'll see the parties will try to encourage a candidate, maybe at a county office. They'll encourage them, grooming them to run for the legislature. But I think it's going to be very hard for even an African-American Republican who had a lot of money and was well known to win as a Republican in an African-American district when there is such a negative feeling on the part of most African Americans toward the Republican Party. You're tied with that. If you could run as an independent, but you can't. You got to be a Republican, and I think in that community it's not a plus. Unfortunately, I think the same is going to happen in the Hispanic community if we don't become a little more tolerant, a little more sensitive on the immigration issue. And I think the window's closing pretty fast right now. I'm not sure if we don't do something in the next year, it's going to be much hope for us.
Let me ask you. You had backed Kirk Dillard, who for governorship. He obviously lost the primary. Bruce Rauner is running. Are you going to be supporting Bruce Rauner?
I will undoubtedly vote for Bruce Rauner. I'm not planning to be real active. The only reason I was active, I've tried to back off of this stuff, but I was active because Kirk Dillard was my former chief of staff, and I really thought he was the right person to bring everybody together and move the state ahead. But he's come close twice, but being close doesn't count in politics. And so I don't know. I don't plan to be real active in this campaign, but I undoubtedly will vote for Bruce Rauner. I right now think if I had to bet money, I would bet he'll win. Just looking at the numbers out there, and the big difference between him and Bill Brady is Bruce Rauner is a social moderate, and I think that's the ingredient we lacked last time. He has that. The situation is just as bad for the Democrats as it was 4 years ago, but I think this candidate on the social issues is positioned correctly to be able to win a general election in Illinois. Now, what could come up about, he's still an unknown. I mean, he's never held office. We don't know all that much about it. We know he's made a lot of money. And I'm sure the Democrats are going to be looking at how he made that money and seeing if there's something that they can throw at him that sticks on him. We don't know until he really goes through a general election campaign just how he might handle that. But right now, looking at the numbers and looking where everybody's positioned, if I had to bet money, I would bet that Mr. Rauner will win the race.
On one hand, I'm almost surprised, not literally, but that given where the state is and the difficulties in managing it going forward, it's going to be quite a task to try to go in to change the state around. And we're just covering an event the other day where Dan Long, the head of who runs the numbers, crunches the numbers for the state, was pointing out that currently the pension systems are about $100 billion, $97.5 billion with unfunded liabilities, aside from the state's operating budget, and that's going to be more problematic now that you are going to have the tax increase go off in January. How does the state begin to turn itself around realistically? I mean, from the financial hole that it's dug itself into?
Well, you could wonder why anybody would want to run for governor. I used to say getting elected wasn't the problem, governing is the problem. It goes back to that word we talked about earlier, discipline. Whoever the governor is going to have to be very fiscally disciplined. No new programs, or if you create a new program, you're going to have to identify the old program you're eliminating and freeing up the money for. You have to have a realistic budget. You can't base a budget on eliminating fraud and waste that they often try to do. I mean, that just, that's part of the Medicaid solution, and we yet have seen that kind of savings. It's going to be a long term. This is not going to be done in a year or two. We're talking 5-6 years at least. We're going to have to be on a fiscal diet, and that's really hard for the elected officials to go 5 or 6 years, keep saying no to people. I mean, I know I had to do it, and it's not something that's in their nature. I think the temporary tax, we're going to have to make that up, whether we enact it after the election, put it back on, or we find some other revenues. We don't have enough revenue to come close to supporting our spending base and to deal with our debt. The pension, I'm not a fan of what they passed. I don't think it's constitutional. I think it's clearly not constitutional. Now, I'm not a Supreme Court justice, so they're the only ones that really know.
Should that have been in the Constitution, do you think? There's this aspect of no legislature can tie the hands of the future legislatures.
That wasn't a legislature, yeah. Well, that's why constitutions are for. I would have said no, but I never dreamed that they would break a contract. I mean, that to me is the basis of of law is you have a contract, you know, it sticks. And
Right.
just because one party didn't do their fiscal responsibility, fiduciary responsibility, then they say, well, we're not going to honor this contract anymore. I don't think you can do that in most cases. So I was surprised they were that specific in the Constitution, but they apparently knew something that I didn't know back in 1970, that, you know, the state government might actually renege on a contract and a commitment. So I think it probably was good it was there. And I don't know how a court could rule in favor of that law unless they're just saying, well, you know, we know what the Constitution says, but we think we know better. I think it's pretty clear. Saying that is they're going to have to do something. And I think, and you don't have to have 100% funding. You know, you're not going to have everybody's not going to retire at the same time. I think that Senator Cullerton's initial approach, trying to figure out some way to do something but still not take away existing benefits, or trying to get some agreement, is a
So
better
where he was
approach.
trying to get a trade-off and make it a part of a
Trade-off, but I
negotiated-
think probably his initial thing I'm not sure if that would have flown. He was at the point where he was negotiating with the unions and things, and I think they might have come up with something there that everybody could have lived with. But I think that the pension thing is still an issue. I don't think we've solved it. I might be wrong. The courts might uphold it. They've made strange decisions in the past, but I would be more surprised if they uphold that, if they don't. So I think we're still going to have to deal with that. But I think you can solve that without going back on all the commitments that were made, or, you know, breaking a contract, which I think is a questionable thing to do. On the spending part, I think you're going to have to cut back spending. I mean, we're not have to be able to create new programs. It's not going to be good, fun, but that's what's going to happen. And if you're going to spend more money, you're going to have to come up with revenues.
What do you think the state, and I'm sorry, I was going to say relative to spending, we have the federal mandate, we have Medicaid, we have Obamacare, and 2 years ago we passed the SMART Act, and allegedly we were going to save $1.5 billion. Now the governor wants to expand Medicaid.
Well, I don't think you can. I think I'd love to. I wanted to give money to people. I love helping particularly poor people, but we help poor people up to the poverty level. Then when we had money and we knew how we were going to pay for it, we expanded that a little bit for kids. But then Blagojevich came in and expanded it much more, but didn't have the money to pay for it. And that's the approach that's got us into this trouble. And if we continue that, again, the hole's just getting deeper. Or we raise taxes. And there are limits on what you can do on taxes. There's no doubt about that. So we're going to have to balance. But there are no easy solutions. There's no silver bullet. I don't think some taxpayers like say, well, let the state workers pay for it. I don't think that's not a solution. It's going to have to be a burden on everyone, and we're going to have to pay more and probably have less to get out of this, and it's going to take time. And that's not a real popular thing to tell the electorate, and I understand why they don't really want to get into that discussion before the election. But after the election, whoever is elected governor is going to have to provide the leadership and the legislature and move the legislature to solve these problems. Again, that's one of the things I think probably Rauner has going in favor of Quinn is, while he is an unknown, he is an unknown. It hasn't worked with Quinn so far. Maybe Rauner can do different, though I don't know. You just won't know till we get there.
Before we wrap up, why don't we just do what is Jim Edgar doing these days?
Jim Edgar is trying to enjoy life. I've finished my thing at the U of I. I'm not doing the classroom stuff anymore. Contract didn't get renewed, so I'm still doing hopefully I'll still do the Edgar Fellow thing, but trying to spend some time out. Grandkids are growing up fast. My oldest is going to be a sophomore in college, so youngest is going to be in 4th grade, so they are growing up quick. So we try to get out and watch them grow up. It's amazing how they don't really have an interest in grandparents when they get to be teenagers, kind of like their
And
parents.
are your grandkids all in Colorado?
They're all in Colorado. you know, I spend time with my horses. It's not the most lucrative business I've ever been involved in, but, you know, we keep plugging along there. Though I'm not sure we're going to have a horse racing industry in Illinois another year or two. I mean, it's, again, that's an example of where state government, to me, pretty easy solution to do some things there, and they've just kind of ignored it. I don't think
Which
because...
is increase the purses, is it?
Well, they do something on doing the slots, and, you know, they did the slots for all the taverns in the state, but they didn't do it for horse racing, and they didn't do it for those towns that had been identified. And, you know, so I'm not sure how long that's going to be viable, at least in Illinois. I'll race my horses, I guess, in Indiana. They do provide slots. It's pretty healthy industry in Indiana. But we, you know, keep busy.
Well, Governor Edgar, we always appreciate you taking the time to talk with us about the issues, and hopefully we can do it again in the future.
Look forward to it.
Thank you.
You're watching the Illinois Channel.